So far, we've been looking at the ways in which Aquinas and Aristotle are more or less similar, right? They agree on their conception of happiness, or Aquinas takes on board a very Aristotelian conception of happiness. He makes some changes, adds some things here and there, thinks Aristotle's wrong about certain kind of specifics. But in general, there's agreement there. Okay, one of the things that you might notice about Aristotle, you might notice it as soon as I start saying something about it. The range of ethical terminology that he makes use of is actually somewhat limited, or it's at the very least, when you consider the range of terminology that we use today, it seems limited. Aristotle, for instance, never really talks about moral obligation, about your obligation to do something. He talks about justice, and that's kind of not always. I mean, he just doesn't really use that word. He doesn't use this idea that there might be some sort of universal moral code or moral law. That's not to say that Aristotle is a relativist. He thinks that no, there's kind of objective universal facts about ethics, about what a good life consists in. But he doesn't isolate moral principles, right? Never steal, things like that. He doesn't isolate moral, you just call them moral principles, but other people would call them something like moral laws, moral commands, right? And a lot of people think that these kinds of laws or commands or moral obligations are really at the heart of morality, at the heart of ethics. And we just don't find anything like that in Aristotle. Aquinas, of course, is drawing on Aristotle, but he's also got other influences. And what's going to be particularly relevant here is this kind of Judeo-Christian influence, which bequeathed to someone like Aquinas a law conception of morality. And so what you might think of here is particularly the figure of Moses, right? So that's a picture of Moses right there. Moses, who received the 10 commandments from God up on Mount Sinai, right? So the 10 commandments said things like, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, covet thy neighbor's wife, covet thy neighbor's goods, thou shalt honor thy parents, and so on. Moses and the Old Testament more generally give us a bunch of laws, and really even into the New Testament. We'll talk about this in just in the next video, actually, right? And so Aquinas, on the one hand, he's got Moses giving him this law conception, and on the other hand, he's got Aristotle. Yeah. And these two conceptions of ethics, so Aristotle focusing on happiness and virtue, and Moses in the kind of more general, the Judeo-Christian tradition, focusing on God as this lawgiver who gave us certain commands that we must follow in obedience to God, right? These are two different influences that are kind of meeting in Aquinas. And at first glance, it's not at all clear how to harmonize those or how to make sense of both of those together. Because Aristotle's God, and again, we didn't go into these details when we were looking at Aristotle, but Aristotle's God does not give commands. Aristotle's God doesn't have any particular interest in human beings or human life. Aristotle's God is not going to send you to heaven or hell or anything like that. Aristotle's God is not really a God that you would pray to, that you would ask things for. It's not a God that's going to get involved in your life and intervene in history and so on. That's not how God works according to Aristotle, right? That's a very, so how can you possibly take something like Aristotelianism and something like this divine or this divine law, right? The fact that God gives laws, that laws are central to ethics. How do you combine those? How do you make those gel? Because Aquinas, I mean, do you have to give up one and keep the other? How do you do that? How is Aquinas going to synthesize these two different ways of conceiving of ethics? This is what we're going to be focusing on. And I think what we're in particular, we're going to focus on is this thing called the natural law. We'll get to that later. But what we're going to see when we look into this thing called the natural law is how exactly Aquinas tries to synthesize this Aristotelian view, which is concerned with happiness and virtue and so on, with this law view, according to which God gives us laws, kind of tells us what we should and should not do, right? So this conception that we get from someone like Moses, say, coming down with the Ten Commandments and so on. All right, so Aquinas is kind of stuck between these two figures, and what he's going to try to do is make sense of them both together, show how they're actually compatible and how they work together, these two different ways of approaching ethics. All right, so he's going to start talking about law then. And so this is going to be new. This is going to be a new kind of consideration. Aristotle just talks about the virtues, about happiness. Now we're going to see something new now, right? This new kind of consideration that we might appeal to in our moral or ethical debates, something like a law, a moral law, what Aquinas calls the natural law. So Aquinas begins very generally. He begins by talking about what all law has in common, whether it's a law that comes from God or a law that human beings make. All law has the following four features in common. This is kind of, you can think of this as Aquinas' definition of what a law is. And so we're going to go through them in order. The first two, there's a lot more to say about. The last two are fairly straightforward and won't spend much time on them. So first, he says that a law is a command of reason. 2 points that I want to draw out in his discussion here. The first point I want to draw out is a kind of interesting etymological point that he makes. He kind of gives us an explanation for why Aristotle never really talked about obligation in particular. That's not what Aquinas' aim is in talking about this, but it does that nonetheless. Aquinas makes an etymological point. What he says is that the word obligate, or what he points out to us, is that the word obligate, which is a Latin-derived word, comes from the word law, right? The L-I-G in the middle of obligate, that is derived from the word for law in Latin. What that means and what he takes that to mean, it makes no sense to talk about someone's being obligated to do something unless there is a law commanding them to do it. Right? And so it's only once we have this idea of a moral law that it would make sense to talk about moral obligations. And in as much as Aristotle doesn't have any idea, or it's no part of Aristotle to talk about a moral law, right? Of course, Aristotle's not going to talk about moral obligation, right? To be obligated is to be commanded to do something by a law, by some law or other. Yeah, that's what Aquinas is pointing out. That's the etymology of this word obligate, and it gives an explanation for why someone like Aristotle just never talks about obligation, what somebody's obligated to do. That's the first interesting point, right? And so it's now that we have this law conception of ethics, it does make sense to talk about moral obligations, right? If we think of God as giving us a moral law or something like that, that's where Aquinas would go with this. Okay. That doesn't say anything about what it means to call a law a command of reason. That's just a kind of interesting etymological point. What does it mean to call a law a command of reason? Aquinas' idea here is that laws are not arbitrary. They're not just made up out of nowhere. They have to have some sort of reason behind them. They have to be grounded in reason. They have to be understandable, intelligible by reason, rationally intelligible, right? You can see the reason for it. If, for instance, here would be a kind of arbitrary, quote, law, one that's not a command of reason, that's not, right? If, let's say the Congress, the legislature, and then the president. The president has to sign a bill to make it a law, right? Let's say they all get together, the House of Representatives and the Senate, and then the president. And they all agree we're going to make it a law that everybody whose name begins with L has to wear size 13 shoes. We make it a law or whatever, right? We pass it and we put our names in. Boom. There's no good reason for that. There's no possible understanding for that. It's not rationally intelligible. It's not grounded in reason at all. It's totally arbitrary. And so what Aquinas would say is that that command, even though it went through the proper avenues, right? It was passed by the House, passed by the Senate, the president signs it, let's say. Yeah, even though it went through all that, and it's now on the books, and they'll arrest you if your name begins with L and you're not wearing a size 13 shoe or whatever, and throw you in jail. Even though it's not actually a law. That's what Aquinas is saying here. It's not actually a law. If it's not in fact a command of reason, if it's not in fact rationally intelligible and grounded in reason, it is not a law. Despite the fact that it's on the books, despite the fact the police will arrest you for violating it, despite the fact that you'll get thrown in prison for violating it, it's not really a law. Okay, so laws are commands of reason. They are rationally intelligible. Second, laws are ordered toward the common good. That's the way Aquinas puts it. It's a little bit misleading in certain ways. Really, the idea is because the common good, that has a specifically human connotation in Aquinas and I think in our own understanding. But Aquinas, as we're going to see, thinks that laws kind of govern everything, not just human beings, but frogs and atoms and everything. We'll talk about that later. Laws are ordered toward the common good. The idea here is that laws order things to their end, to a goal, to some sort of end or goal. And the end or goal of a thing is its good. So laws order things to the good, basically, is, to speak in general terms as possible. We're going to see more specifically what that's going to mean as we proceed and talk about the specific kinds of laws. But laws order things to the good. In this specifically human case, right, when we're thinking about human beings in particular, so laws apply to human beings, that's for sure. Not just to human beings, though, and that's why this is a little bit misleading. But when we're looking at the human case, the end or goal of a human being, according to Aquinas and according to Aristotle, is happiness, beatitude. And so laws that govern human beings should order human beings toward happiness, toward beatitude. And not just toward my beatitude, but towards everybody's beatitude, right? The laws are for everybody. And so it should order it towards, so laws then, for human beings at least, are going to order us toward kind of common happiness, everybody's happiness. That's the common good. The common good simply is the beatitude of everybody. And so inasmuch as laws obligate all human beings, inasmuch as a law does that, it's ordering all human beings toward the common good, towards the happiness of all human beings. Laws are supposed to order us to our own good. That's the idea. So laws are supposed to make the people subject to them good. Something like that is the idea. And again, Aquinas is going to say, let's say we get some, just take that silly example I was using earlier. Everyone whose name begins with L has to wear a size 13 shoe. That doesn't order people toward the good, toward beatitude. Aquinas say that's absolutely right. And so that is not, in fact, a law. Even though it was signed by all the people, even though the president, blah, 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 even though they'll arrest you and throw you in jail and so on, not, in fact, a law. And then the kind of what follows from that, the implication of that, if it's not in fact a law, it's not in fact obligating you to do anything. The people who come and arrest you and throw you in jail, they're doing something wrong if they do that, right? For if your name begins with L and you're not wearing a size 13 shoe, you're not actually required to wear a size 13 shoe if your name begins with L, because that's not actually a law. Those are the first two. Those are kind of the most important ones, most important features his conception of law. And people who think about the very general nature of law kind of going forward, there's a field of philosophy called the philosophy of law. People in philosophy do it. People in law schools do it, write in the philosophy of law. These first two features of law would by far be the most controversial features of Aquinas' conception of law. Third, this is much less controversial, and fourth is much less controversial too. Third feature of a law, according to Aquinas, of any law you like, every law that's actually law is going to have these features. Third feature of a law is that it has to be made by the proper authority. And this is pretty obvious, right? So God is obviously, for Aquinas, going to be a proper authority. God can make a law if God wants. Okay, fine, right? But then the proper authority for what Aquinas is going to call the human law, which again we'll talk about later, that's going to be something like your Congress or something, your legislative branch of government, right? They are a proper authority. Get even more local though, just to give you an illustration of what this idea means. There are certain policies that Loyola has that you might not like. Certain things from the Code of Student Conduct. Now, I can't think of what exactly they are, but let's say, I remember I've asked classes this before. I can't remember what they are. I can't remember if, well, yeah. Let's take this one. Let's say they have a rule that you can't have any alcohol in the dorms. Yeah. Regardless of whether you're 21 or not, no alcohol in the dorms. Let's say that's a rule that Loyola has passed. And let's say I hear you guys complaining about that. And so I say, I hereby decree, me, Jeff Fisher, I decree that you can have alcohol in the dorms. Well, that doesn't actually change the policy. I can decree that all I want. I don't actually change the policy. I don't actually change the law, so to speak. I'm not the proper authority. The Office of Student Conduct, I don't know. I don't know who it is, right? But some office, some administrative office somewhere is the proper authority for something like that. Not me, right? And so I can say what I want, all I want, right? You can do blah, 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 blah. It's not going to actually change the law because I'm not the proper authority, right? The law is really only a law if it's made by a proper authority. Since I'm not a proper authority, I can say whatever I want. It's not going to become a law, right? That's the idea. Again, fairly commonsensical and intuitive. I can't just say, for example, the law is now that nobody pays taxes. That's not going to make it the law. It's still the law that you have to pay taxes. Yeah. Lastly, laws have to be promulgated. That's a fancy word. It's a legal word. All it means is kind of decreed, made public, written down, and here it is, guys, right? Promulgated, decreed, written down, announced, something registered in some way. That's all it means, right? And so if it wouldn't actually be a law if you just kind of kept it to yourself. So if the United States Congress, whatever, passed a law and then didn't tell anybody about it, didn't write it down anywhere, no one had any access to it, they never announced it or decreed it, and so nobody knew except the people who wrote the law and whatever, wouldn't actually be a law yet. They have to announce it. They have to make it public. They have to publish it in some way. Only then is it a law, right? And so a law, his general definition of law is going to be that it's a command of reason ordered toward the common good made by the proper authority and promulgated. And if any one of those features is missing from some decree, it's not in fact a law. That's Aquinas' idea. That's his conception of law in general. In the next video, we're going to look at the specific kinds of law that Aquinas thinks there are.